June 14th, 1944, 0537 hours, outside St. Lo, Normandy. A Sherman tank tears through a 12-foot hedgerow. Steel tusks rip ancient roots from Norman soil. German gunners scramble, their ambush positions now worthless. June 1944, Normandy. The bocage has become a graveyard for American armor. This is the story of how one sergeant's scrap metal modification broke the deadlock that nearly lost the Normandy campaign. Sergeant Curtis G. Culin Jr. pressed his back against the hull of his disabled Sherman. The metal still radiated heat from the penetrating shot. 20 yards ahead, Sergeant Bill Davidson's tank burned, black smoke spiraling into the gray morning sky. The hedgerow they'd been trying to navigate had funneled them perfectly into the killing zone. The bocage. 4,000 years of French farmers had built these barriers, earth-packed walls crowned with bramble, thorn, and root systems that plunged 15 feet deep. Every field a fortress, every lane a death trap. The Germans hadn't built these defenses. They'd simply recognized what history had handed them. Cullen's hand shook as he pulled out a cigarette. Third tank he'd seen burn in 2 days, all attempting the same impossible task: navigate roads the Germans watched like hawks, or try to climb hedgerows and expose their vulnerable belly armor to Panzerfausts waiting on the other side. The architects of D-Day had missed something catastrophic. Aerial reconnaissance photos showed the hedgerows, neat green lines crisscrossing the Norman countryside. Pretty, geometric. The intelligence officers had estimated them at 3 to 4 feet high, standard agricultural hedges that tanks could easily push through or drive over. They were wrong by a factor of 3. June 6th had been the easy part. The beaches, for all their horror, had been conquered in a day. But now, 8 days after the largest amphibious invasion in history, the Allied advance had ground to a crawl. Not because of German counterattacks. Not because of supply issues, because of bushes. Ancient, impenetrable, perfect ambush bushes. 1st Army Headquarters, June 15th, 800 hours. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley studied the map with the expression of a man watching his strategy collapse in real time. Red pens marked destroyed American armor. There were too many. Gentlemen, we have landed 300,000 men and 50,000 vehicles on these beaches, Bradley said, his Missouri accent tight with frustration. And we've advanced an average of 6 miles inland. 6 miles. Major General Leonard T. Jarrow, commanding V Corps, traced a finger along the hedgerow patterns. Sir, the problem is geometric. Each field averages 200 by 400 feet. That's approximately 85,000 individual enclosures between here and our objectives. Every single one provides perfect defensive positioning. What are the tank losses? 47 Shermans in the last 72 hours, sir. Not from superior German armor, from Panzerfausts fired at point-blank range while our tanks are climbing hedgerows. The math was devastating. At this rate, they'd run out of tanks before they ran out of hedgerows. And if this story surprises you as much as it shocked Allied command, hit that like button, because what happened next came from the last place anyone expected. Now let's go back to that disabled Sherman. June 15th, 1944, 1430 hours. 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, bivouac. Cullen couldn't sleep. He'd tried, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Davidson's face in the instant before the Panzerfaust hit. Confusion more than fear, like a man betrayed by a simple promise. Tanks can cross hedgerows. He walked the perimeter, smoking, thinking. His boots crunched on something metallic. He looked down. German beach obstacles. Thousands of them. When the engineers had cleared the landing zones, they'd cut apart the massive steel hedgehogs, welded rails and girders designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. The pieces had been bulldozed inland, waiting for salvage operations that might never come because nobody had time to think about scrap metal when you were fighting for every 100 yards. Cullen picked up a section, heavy-gauge steel, sharp angles. He held it up to eye level, imagining it welded to the front of a Sherman, not as a battering ram. That wouldn't work. The hedgerows were too massive, too dense. But as teeth, tusks, something that could bite into the earth beneath the hedgerow, grip the root system, and rip it out wholesale. The idea was so simple it felt stupid, which meant it was either brilliant or he'd lost his mind. Maybe both. He found Lieutenant Colonel John B. Coulter before reveille the next morning. "Sir, I need a tank, a welding crew, and 12 hours. Coulter looked at the sketch Culin had drawn on the back of a ration box. 4 curved steel prongs, angled forward and down, mounted to the bow of a Sherman. "Sergeant, engineering solutions need to go through proper channels. Ordnance, R&D. We can't just modify Army property because—" "Sir," Cullen's voice had an edge that made officers uncomfortable. "I've watched 6 crews burn, good men. We don't have time for proper channels. The Germans figured out the bocage in 6 hours. We've been here 9 days. Coulter studied the younger man. Culin was 24, high school education. Before the war, he'd worked in a cabinet shop in Cranford, New Jersey. Not an engineer, not a tactician, just a man who'd watched friends die from a problem that seemed unsolvable because everyone was thinking about it wrong. 12 hours, Coulter said. But if this doesn't work, the welding cost comes out of my discretionary budget, and you're explaining to battalion why we wasted resources. June 17, 1944, 0620 hours, field modification site. The welding crew thought Culin was crazy. Sergeant Jimmy DiPietro, who'd done ironwork in Pittsburgh before the war, kept shaking his head. "Sarge, you're adding 800 pounds to the front of this tank. That's going to throw off the weight distribution. The transmission isn't rated for, so we add counterweight in back. And the tusks are going to dig into the ground, create massive resistance. The engine will, that's the point. We want them to dig in, to grab the root system. You can't grab roots through 6 feet of earth-packed wall. Watch me." They worked through the day, cutting, measuring, welding. The prongs, Culin insisted on 4 of them, each 6 feet long, were angled at 25 degrees forward and down. The geometry mattered. Too steep and they'd just plow earth. Too shallow and they'd skip over the hedgerow base. The German steel was perfect, harder than American mild steel, sharp. Each prong tapered to a brutal point that could penetrate compacted earth like a spade through sand. By 1800 hours, the modified Sherman looked like an angry rhinoceros. Someone said it out loud. "Looks like a rhino." The name stuck. June 18, 1944, 0615 hours. Test field 2 kilometers south of Carentan. Colonel Coulter assembled 20 officers to watch. The test hedgerow was typical, 12 feet high, ancient, with root systems that had been growing since the 100 Years' War. On the other side, they'd position target dummies where German infantry would typically set up ambush positions. Culin climbed into the driver's seat. His hands were steady now. Either this worked or he'd just proven himself a fool in front of 24 superior officers. He throttled up. The Sherman's Ford GAAV-8 roared, 500 horsepower pushing 33 tons of armor and welded German scrap toward an obstacle that had stopped the Allied advance cold for 2 weeks. The tusks hit the hedgerow at 15 miles per hour. What happened next changed modern warfare. The steel prongs didn't bounce, didn't deflect. They punched through the earth-packed wall like spears, buried themselves in the root system beneath, and used the tank's momentum to rip the entire structure upward. The hedgerow exploded, not metaphorically. It literally came apart. A 30-foot section of 4,000-year-old agricultural engineering torn from the earth in a shower of dirt, roots, and bramble. The Sherman didn't climb, didn't expose its belly. It plowed straight through, maintaining full armor protection, emerging on the other side with clear fields of fire on the target positions. Elapsed time, 11 seconds. The officers stood in silence. Then someone started clapping. June 19, 1944, 1st Army Headquarters. Bradley listened to Coulter's report with the intensity of a man being offered salvation. When the colonel finished, the general asked only one question: "How many can we make?" "Sir, every tank. We have unlimited raw material. The Germans left us thousands of tons of beach obstacles. Every welding crew in the Army can do this modification, Time per tank, 6 hours. Make it 3 hours. I want 300 Rhino tanks operational by June 25th. Bradley turned to his logistics officer. Cancel all non-essential welding operations. Repair work gets bumped. This is priority 1. Sir, the British are developing their own hedgerow solution, the AVRE with a fascine bundle, and I don't care if Churchill himself invented a flying tank. Culin's device works. It's fast, and we can make it with scrap metal. Get it done. What happened next was the fastest field modification program in military history. Every beach obstacle from Omaha to Utah, thousands of hedgehogs, tetrahedrons, and check barriers was cut apart and repurposed. Welding crews worked 18-hour shifts. Ordnance officers stopped worrying about proper requisition forms and started worrying about keeping the oxyacetylene tanks full. The Germans noticed the activity but completely misinterpreted it. Luftwaffe reconnaissance reported Americans were reinforcing tank armor with additional plating. Logical but wrong. German intelligence assumed the Allies were responding to Panzerfaust threats with heavier frontal armor. They expected stronger walls. They got a can opener. June 25, 1944, Zophor 30 hours, assembly area near St. Lo. Captain James M. Burt, commanding a company of Rhino-modified Shermans, briefed his crews in the pre-dawn darkness. His voice carried the controlled excitement of a man about to test a theory that could save lives or waste them. Gentlemen, today we're not following the roads. We're not looking for gaps. We're going to drive straight through bocage country like it doesn't exist. The Germans have spent 2 weeks learning our patterns. They know we funnel through roads and gates. Today we show them that every field is now a road. Sir, Sergeant Mike Kahala from Honolulu asked, what if we hit a hedgerow with Germans dug in on the other side? Then they're in the wrong place when we come through. The rhino tusks don't give them time to react. We breach, we fire. They don't know which field we're coming from because we're coming from all of them. The attack began at first light. Operation Cobra was still a month away, but this was the prototype, the tactical approach that would eventually break the Normandy stalemate. Burt's company hit the German defensive line at 6 different points simultaneously, not roads, not gaps. 6 random hedgerows that the Germans hadn't bothered to defend because tanks can't cross hedgerows. Except now they could. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Obergefreiter Klaus Heinz, manning an MG-42 position south of St. Lo, wrote in his diary that night, we heard the engines but could not see them. Then the earth itself attacked. The hedge exploded and a metal beast emerged where no tank could go. We fired, but it was already past us, and another came from a different field, and another. They are everywhere now. The bocage is no longer ours. German defensive doctrine had relied on channeling American armor into predictable killing zones. The Rhino tanks made every approach unpredictable. A company of 12 Shermans could now attack from 12 different directions simultaneously, and the Germans couldn't cover them all. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, inspecting the sector 3 days later, saw the severed hedgerows and understood immediately. He wrote to his wife, the Americans have solved the hedgerow problem, not with better tactics or more men, but with a simple mechanical modification that renders our defensive advantages obsolete. This will change everything. It did. By July 1st, over 500 Sherman tanks had been fitted with Culin's tusks. The modification was so successful that Ordnance officially designated it the Culin device and began factory installation on new tanks shipping from the States. But the soldiers never used the official name. They were Rhino tanks. Always would be. July 25, 1944, 1100 hours, Operation Cobra launch. 3 infantry divisions and 2 armored divisions, over 150,000 men, and 1,500 Rhino-modified tanks hit the German lines in a concentrated assault that bore no resemblance to the grinding attrition warfare of mid-June. The Americans simply ignored the bocage, plowed through it, appeared in fields the Germans considered secure, flanked positions that couldn't be flanked. The breakthrough happened in 72 hours. What had taken 3 weeks to advance 6 miles now covered 30 miles in 3 days. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr Division, reported to his superiors, "My division is annihilated, not by superior tactics, but by the enemy's ability to attack from terrain we considered impassable. The modified American tanks have rendered the Norman countryside defenseless." Subscribe so you don't miss the next incredible story of battlefield ingenuity that official histories forgot. Now the aftermaths under August 15, 1944, award ceremony, 1st Army HQ. Curtis Culin stood at attention while Bradley pinned the Legion of Merit to his uniform. The citation praised technical ingenuity and initiative that directly contributed to the success of Operation Cobra and the liberation of France. Culin didn't feel like he'd invented anything. He just looked at a problem differently. While engineers and generals had been thinking about how to make tanks better at climbing hedgerows, he'd asked a different question. How do we make hedgerows irrelevant? The answer had been lying in piles of scrap metal for 2 weeks. After the ceremony, a young lieutenant from Ordnance approached him. "Sergeant, I'm supposed to debrief you on the development process for the official records. Did you do calculations, stress analysis, test different angles?" Culin smiled. I held up a piece of German beach obstacle and imagined it on the front of my tank. Then I tried it. That's the whole process. But the angle of the prongs, the spacing, the weight distribution. "Lieutenant, I made cabinets before the war. You don't calculate how wood grain will split. You look at it, you feel it, you know." "Same thing." The officer wrote furiously. "So your methodology was intuitive?" "My methodology was watching friends burn and deciding that was unacceptable." The Rhino tanks weren't the most sophisticated innovation of World War II. They weren't revolutionary in design. They didn't require new technology or rare materials. They were, in the truest sense, a field expedient, a desperate solution to a desperate problem. But they embodied something more profound than tactical innovation. They represented the moment when the institutional military, with its hierarchies, procedures, and proper channels, stepped aside and let a 24-year-old sergeant with a high school education and a cabinet-making background solve a problem that had stumped generals and engineers. The U.S. Army produced 3,000 Rhino modifications between June and August 1944. After the breakout from Normandy, their utility diminished. The terrain changed, the war became mobile, the hedgerows were behind them, most of the tusks were eventually removed and scrapped. But in those crucial 6 weeks, they were the difference between stalemate and victory. October 1944, Camp Shanks, New York. Culin rotated home after being wounded near Metz. The medal was nice, the handshakes from officers were nice. What mattered was a letter he received from Mike Kahala, still fighting in France. "Sarge, remember when we tested the first Rhino and you were sure it would work, but nobody believed you? Yesterday we plowed through a hedgerow outside Nancy. It was just a hedgerow, nothing special. But I thought about those first 2 weeks in Normandy, when every hedge was a death sentence. You changed that. You made them just hedges again, that's all. Just wanted you to know." Just hedges again. The bocage hadn't become less formidable. The earth-packed walls were still 12 feet high. The root system still plunged 15 feet deep. German defensive positions were still expertly placed. But they weren't death traps anymore, because a sergeant from New Jersey had looked at the problem and seen it differently. 1984, 40 years later. Curtis Culin attended a D-Day anniversary event in Normandy. Now in his 60s, retired, still living in Cranford. A French historian approached him with a question. "Monsieur Culin, there is something the veterans wonder about. Why did it take so long? The beach obstacles were there from June 6th. The hedgerows were obviously a problem by June 8th. Why did no one think of your solution until June 15th? Culin considered the question. He'd been asked variations of it for 40 years. "Because everyone was looking up," he said finally, "looking at how to get over the hedgerows. I was looking down, at the scrap metal, at what we already had. That is the difference between intelligence and wisdom? No. That's the difference between being an engineer and being desperate. Engineers solve problems elegantly. Desperate men solved them immediately. The historian wrote it down, then asked, "Do you know how many lives your modification saved?" "No, and I don't want to, because then I'd have to think about the ones that died before we figured it out, the ones who burned because I didn't think of it on June 7th instead of June 15th. The Rhino tanks represent a peculiar category of military innovation, the solution that seems obvious in retrospect but invisible in the moment. After Culin demonstrated the principle, dozens of officers claimed they'd had similar ideas. Perhaps they had. But ideas don't save lives. Action does. Welding does, risking ridicule to test something that might not work. The official U.S. Army history of the Normandy campaign dedicates 3 paragraphs to the Culin device, 3 paragraphs for the innovation that broke the Bocage stalemate. The liberation of Paris gets 20 pages. The strategic bombing campaign gets 40. But ask any tanker who fought in Normandy, and they'll talk about the Rhino tanks before they talk about anything else. Because those tusks, ugly, simple, welded from enemy scrap, were the difference between dying in a metal coffin and making it home. The Germans never developed a counter. How do you counter a modification that makes your primary defensive advantage irrelevant? They tried reinforcing hedgerows with mines, but the Rhino tusks detonated them during the breach. They tried pre-positioning more anti-tank guns, but couldn't cover every possible approach vector. They tried requesting specialized weapons from Berlin, but by the time requisitions were approved, the Americans were already past the Bocage. They'd been outmaneuvered by a cabinet maker with a welding torch. 2019, the National World War II Museum, New Orleans. A restored Sherman with Culin tusks occupies the center of the North Africa and Europe gallery. The placard reads, "Rhino Tank, modified June 1944 by Sergeant Curtis G. Culin Jr. This field modification enabled Allied forces to break through the Norman Bocage and advance into France. School groups walk past it. Most don't stop. The tank looks odd with its forward-jutting prongs, like a creature from prehistoric times. The tusks are rusty now, decorative, no longer sharp enough to rip through 4,000-year-old root systems. But in the summer of 1944, they were the sharpest implement in the European theater, not because of metallurgy, not because of engineering, because of what they represented, the willingness to see problems differently when conventional wisdom leads to body counts." Curtis Culin died in 2013 at age 93. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned the Legion of Merit, his post-war career in cabinet making, his 3 children and 7 grandchildren. It mentioned the Rhino tanks in the 3rd paragraph. He would have approved. He'd never wanted to be famous for modifying tanks. He'd wanted his friends to stop dying. The modification gave him that, and in doing so, gave the Allies the mobility they needed to win the ground war in Europe. Simple, obvious, invisible until it wasn't. The Bocage still exists. Drive through Normandy today, and you'll see the same hedgerows, slightly smaller after decades of agricultural modernization, but still formidable. Tour guides tell visitors about the tactical nightmare they presented, about the American advance grinding to a halt, about the breakthrough that changed everything. Most of them don't mention Culin's name. They call it the hedgerow modification or the American tank innovation. But the tankers knew. In letters home, in memoirs, in conversations around VFW halls for 70 years, they called them Rhino Tanks. And they credited a sergeant from Jersey who looked at scrap metal and saw salvation. Not because he was smarter than the generals, not because he was a better engineer than the Ordnance Corps, because he was desperate and watching friends burn. And sometimes that's what innovation really is, desperation meeting opportunity, wielded by someone who refuses to accept that the current solution is the only solution. The hedgerows are still there. The tusks are in museums. The tanks are long scrapped. But the principle remains. When the problem seems insurmountable, look down at what you already have, at what everyone else is ignoring. The answer might be rusting at your feet.